The clock in the upstairs hall struck 11:59, and Cora Wilkes felt the house itself inhale. Outside, the October wind scraped bare branches across the leaded windows of Blackthorn Manor like fingernails testing for weakness. Inside, every candle in the bridal suite guttered at once, though no draught could reach them. Cora stood alone in her grandmother's wedding dress, ivory silk gone the color of old bone, watching the man she had married 6 hours earlier close the door with a soft, deliberate click. He turned the key. The sound was small, almost polite, yet it landed between her shoulder blades like an axe. "You look beautiful, darling," he said, and his voice was still Henry's voice, warm, Virginian, fond, but the consonants had begun to rot at the edges, the way fruit goes when something wicked has already nested inside. Cora's fingers tightened around the silver cake knife she had carried upstairs hidden beneath her bouquet. The blade was tarnished, older than the house itself, engraved with initials that were not hers, EW 1898. She had found it weeks ago in a locked drawer, wrapped in a lock of hair the color of autumn leaves. Henry, no, not Henry anymore, loosened his tie and smiled the way he had smiled in the garden when he proposed, only now the smile kept going, stretching wider than a mouth should allow, revealing teeth that looked suddenly too numerous. "Did you really think," he whispered, stepping out of his polished shoes, "that changing the date, the church, the dress, that any of it, would matter? The vow was spoken. The ring is on your finger. Midnight belongs to me." The candles flared higher, blue at the center, and for one heartbeat the man in front of her wore a different face entirely. High cheekbones, raven hair slicked back with old-fashioned pomade, eyes like holes burned through paper. Then the mask slipped back into place, and gentle Henry blinked at her with counterfeit confusion. Cora tasted iron. She had bitten her tongue to keep from screaming. The clock began to chime. She had 1 minute, 60 seconds, to decide whether the fifth Wilkes bride would be found cold and staring at the canopy tomorrow morning like all the others, or whether the knife in her hand would finally write a different ending in someone else's blood. The first stroke of midnight sounded. She raised the blade. September 17, 1898, broke cold and bright over the Blue Ridge, the kind of morning that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Blackthorn Manor, still raw with new money and older secrets, glittered with 100 gas lamps for the wedding of Eliza Wilkes, only daughter of the timber baron Amos Wilkes. Eliza was 21, pale as the dogwood blossoms pinned in her dark hair, and laughing in a way that made every man in the county believe love was possible. The groom was a stranger who had arrived in town 6 weeks earlier, Edmund Whitlock, tall, black-haired, soft-spoken, claiming to be a surveyor from Richmond with letters of introduction no one quite remembered reading. He had courted Eliza with a courtliness that felt borrowed from another century, bringing her pressed violets that never wilted and quoting poetry in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. By the time the banns were read, half the valley was half in love with him, and the other half too afraid to say why. The ceremony took place at dusk in the new ballroom because Eliza insisted the mountains looked best when the sun bled out behind them. 300 guests drank champagne punched with mountain laurel honey and watched Eliza promise herself to a man whose eyes caught the candlelight like wet river stones. When the minister pronounced them married, Edmund kissed her with a hunger that made the older women fan themselves and the younger ones blush behind their gloves. Then the orchestra struck up a waltz, and the night spun itself into a bright, reckless whirl. By 11 the guests had gone home through the frost. By midnight the house was quiet except for the wind worrying the shutters. The newlyweds climbed the grand staircase together, Eliza's train over Edmund's arm like a spill of moonlight. At the top landing he paused to light the lamp outside their bedroom door, and for a moment the flame showed something in his face that made the maid hovering with hot water bottles step backward into shadow. The door closed. The key turned. At dawn the housemaid knocked, then knocked again. When no answer came she fetched the housekeeper, who fetched Amos Wilkes himself, still smelling of last night's bourbon and triumph. The master of the house pounded once, twice, then put his shoulder to the oak. The lock gave with a splintering sigh. Eliza lay across the bridal bed fully dressed, veil still pinned beneath her hair, arms flung wide as though she had tried to embrace the morning. Her throat had been opened ear to ear with a single, perfect cut. The blood had soaked the lace of her bodice until it looked black in the grey light. There was no weapon in the room. There was no groom at all. The window was latched from the inside. The only footprints in the frost on the balcony belonged to Eliza herself, bare and delicate, ending at the balustrade where the mountains dropped away into nothing. October 13, 1923, arrived with a hard frost that turned the tobacco fields silver and made the river smoke. Blackthorn Manor had fallen quiet since Eliza's death. The ballroom mirrors were veiled, the chandeliers draped in cheesecloth like mourning widows. Yet money still grew on the mountainsides, and Amos Wilkes, older now, his hair gone the color of ash, needed the world to see that the family name could not be buried with one girl. His granddaughter Margaret was the only living bearer of the Wilkes bloodline left. She was 23, red-haired, reckless with laughter the way some people are reckless with money, and she had decided the curse, if curse it was nothing more than bad luck and worse men. She chose a groom from Charlottesville, Thomas Ashby, a lawyer with round spectacles and a gentle mouth who swore he did not believe in ghosts. They set the wedding for a Saturday when the moon would be new and dark, because Margaret insisted darkness was honest. The ceremony was smaller than Eliza's had been. Only 80 guests crowded into the old music room where the piano had not been played since 1898. Margaret wore her mother's remade dress, the same ivory silk cut shorter at the hem, scandalously above the ankle, and she carried mountain asters dyed blood red. When the vows were spoken, she kissed Thomas so hard his glasses fogged, and the congregation laughed with relief, as though joy itself could cauterize an old wound. After the toasts, the couple slipped away early. Margaret had insisted on the East Suite this time, the one whose windows looked over the family cemetery instead of the mountains. She told the maids she wanted to wake up among her own people, dead or not. The staff obeyed, though they crossed themselves when they thought no one noticed. At 3 a.m, the housekeeper woke to the sound of a single scream cut short, the way a violin string snaps. She ran barefoot down the corridor, nightgown flapping like a torn sail. The door to the East Suite stood ajar. Inside, the fire had burned low and blue. Margaret lay on her back across the hearthrug, the red asters scattered around her like drops of fresh paint. Her throat had been opened again, one clean stroke, deeper this time, almost to the spine. The blood had pooled and cooled into something thick and shining. Thomas Ashby was nowhere in the house. His hat hung neatly on the hall stand, his shoes sat side by side beneath the chair where he had left them, socks folded inside. The window was closed, the latch fastened. Outside, the frost lay unbroken except for Margaret's own bare footprints walking once toward the glass and never returning. May 24, 1947, came in hot and humming, the kind of mountain spring that fools dogwoods into blooming twice. Blackthorn Manor had been painted white again, the mirrors uncovered, the war finally over and ration books burning in backyard barrels all across the county. Rose Wilkes, Margaret's younger sister who had been sent away to boarding school the week her sister died, came home at 22 with a secretarial degree and a mouth set like a snapped trap. She announced her engagement to Daniel Carver, a lieutenant freshly mustered out of Patton's Third Army, Bronze Star, crooked smile, and a Carolina drawl thick enough to spread on biscuits. He laughed at ghost stories and kissed Rose in full view of the porch swing, daring the house to do its worst. The wedding was held at noon because Rose refused anything that smelled of midnight. She wore a simple satin dress ordered from Richmond, no veil, fresh gardenias pinned behind one ear. Only 50 guests sat beneath a tent on the south lawn while a colored quartet played Glenn Miller tunes softened for church. When the justice of the peace told Daniel he could kiss the bride, he dipped Rose low enough that her shoes left the grass and every aunt clapped like the curse had finally been starved to death. They served fried chicken and champagne punch until dusk, then the couple disappeared into the house with a bottle of bourbon and a wink. Rose had chosen the old nursery on the 3rd floor, bright wallpaper, iron bed painted white, windows that caught the sunrise. She told the family it was because she wanted their marriage to begin in a room where children had once been happy. At 2:17 a.m. the night nurse hired for Great-Aunt Lydia heard what she later described as paper tearing, slow and deliberate. She found the nursery door closed but not locked. Inside, the overhead bulb flickered like a dying moth. Rose sat upright against the headboard, gardenias still in her hair, eyes wide open to the ceiling. Her throat had been cut so precisely the two sides of the wound almost touched when her head tilted. Blood had traced the roses on the wallpaper into something darker and wetter. Daniel Carver was gone. His uniform jacket hung on the back of the rocking chair, medals lined up like obedient soldiers. His boots stood beneath, laces still knotted. On the desk lay Rose's diary, open to the last entry written in frantic pencil strokes. He isn't Daniel when the moon is full. His eyes go black from corner to corner like spilled ink, and he calls me Eliza. Tell mother I'm sorry I came home. The windows were locked. The floorboards showed only Rose's bare feet walking in frantic circles that ended at the bed. July the 8th, 1972, smelled of honeysuckle and gasoline. Blackthorn Manor had central air now, avocado appliances in the kitchen, and a television in every bedroom blaring coverage of Nixon's latest scandal. Lillian Wilkes, Rose's niece, raised in Richmond by an aunt who swore the mountains were poisoned, turned 25 that spring and decided the only way to outrun a curse was to refuse it a stage. No church, no ballroom, no midnight toast. She and her fiancé, Michael Brennan, an architect with shaggy hair and wire-rimmed glasses, planned to elope to the courthouse in Asheville, marry in daylight, and drive straight to Myrtle Beach before anyone could object. They almost made it. The night before the courthouse date, Lillian's grandmother, the last person alive who had seen Margaret bleed out on the hearthrug, telephoned in hysterics and begged her to spend one final night at the manor, just one, for tradition's sake. Lillian laughed, said traditions were what got her aunts killed, but Michael, ever courteous, insisted they swing by so the old woman could give the bride her something old. They arrived at dusk in Michael's yellow Mustang convertible, top down, 8-track blasting the Allman Brothers. Grandmother met them on the porch with a velvet box containing Eliza's original pearl choker, the one stained faint rust at the clasp. She pressed it into Lillian's hand with shaking fingers and whispered, "Wear it or don't, but do not sleep under this roof without something that remembers." Lillian rolled her eyes, kissed the old woman's cheek, and promised they would only stay long enough for a drink. They never left. Sometime after midnight the housekeeper, now on salary and half-deaf from years of rock concerts in the carriage house, woke to the sound of the Mustang's engine turning over and dying, like someone trying to start it with no key. She shuffled downstairs in her robe and found the front door wide open, the car idling empty in the drive, headlights cutting tunnels through the fog. Upstairs, the honeymoon suite, repainted sunshine yellow in 1968 and renamed the Sunrise Room, was locked from the inside. When the sheriff broke the chain, they found Lillian on the floor in her traveling dress, blue polyester with white piping, the pearl choker snapped and scattered like hailstones. Her neck had been twisted so violently the spine showed through the skin, a pale grin beneath the ruin of her throat. Michael's clothes were folded on the cedar chest, wallet on top, keys beside it. His body was simply absent, as though the house had inhaled him. The only disturbance in the thick shag carpet was a single set of Lillian's bare footprints leading from the bed to the locked door and stopping. November 3rd, 1999, smelled of hospital antiseptic and the menthol's great-aunt Evelyn smoked even while the oxygen hissed beside her bed. She was 93, skin thin as onion paper, eyes still sharp as broken glass. For 4 generations the family had kept a vigil at her side every autumn, waiting for her to take the secret with her. Instead, on the night the first frost silvered the parking lot, she crooked one skeletal finger at Cora, 19 and home from college for the weekend, and told her to lock the door. Cora obeyed. Evelyn's voice had shrunk to a whisper that scraped like dry leaves. She spoke without pause, as though the words had been dammed up for a century and the dam had finally cracked. In the fall of 1897, Evelyn said, her own Aunt Eliza, barely 18, had been promised to a timber heir from Tennessee. On the eve of the engagement party, Eliza slipped out to the summer house with a traveling portrait painter named Edmund Whitlock. He was beautiful the way a straight razor is beautiful. Clean lines, cold shine, and a promise of cutting. They became lovers in the space of one moonlit week. When Eliza's father discovered them, he had Whitlock horsewhipped off the property and Eliza locked in her room until she agreed to marry the approved suitor. 3 nights later Whitlock returned alone, climbing the trellis to Eliza's window with a derringer in his coat. He begged her to run away with him. She refused, afraid, ashamed, already pregnant with a child she would never dare name. In the struggle the pistol went off. Eliza fell back onto her bed with a hole through her heart. Whitlock, covered in her blood, understood in that instant that he would hang for murder. So he pressed the still warm barrel beneath his own chin and finished what grief had started. But something else finished with him. As his body cooled on the rug, the thing that had worn Edmund Whitlock like a coat peeled away from the corpse and spoke with a voice older than the mountains. It cursed the Wilkes bloodline in a language that made the mirrors sweat. Every daughter born to the house would marry, it said, and on the night the vow was sealed her husband would become its vessel. He would cut her throat before the marriage could be consummated, and the curse would drink the terror of the bride and the betrayal of the groom both. Only when a Wilkes bride spilled the vessel's blood first, at the exact stroke of midnight, would the debt be paid. Evelyn's eyes never left Cora's face while she spoke. When the heart monitor flatlined at 11:59 p.m., the old woman's last breath carried a single word: remember. October 2024 found Cora Wilkes 35 years old, living in a loft in Richmond with north-facing windows and no mirrors larger than a dinner plate. She had built a life of clean lines and deliberate distance, no inherited jewelry, no mountain vacations, no relationships that lasted long enough to require meeting anyone's mother. The name Blackthorn Manor existed only in a sealed box of childhood photographs she had never opened. Then Henry Lau arrived. He was a restorer of rare books, soft-spoken, hands always faintly blue from indigo ink, eyes the color of river clay after rain. They met when Cora, working late at the university press, spilled coffee across a first-edition Poe he had been sent to salvage. Instead of anger he laughed, blotted the stain with a handkerchief that smelled of cedar, and asked if she believed words could be cursed. Something in the way he said it made her answer honestly, "I believe some words should never be read aloud." Within a month they were finishing each other's sentences. Within 3 he knew every scar on her childhood, except the one carved deepest. He proposed on a Tuesday in February, no ring, just a strip of vellum he had torn from a damaged 19th-century diary and written on in iron-gall ink, "Will you let me love you enough to outrun anything that tries to follow you home?" Cora stared at the question for a long time. She thought of Evelyn's last rattling breath, of the 4 locked rooms, of footprints that ended where no living woman could walk. Then she thought of Henry's hands steadying hers the night she woke screaming from a dream of blood on ivory silk. She said yes before fear could change its mind. They set the date for October 25, 2025, exactly 1 year to plan, time enough, she told herself, to be sure. She let him talk her into holding the ceremony at Blackthorn Manor because the house belonged to a conservation trust now and the gardens were public and daylight was safe. She even agreed to wear Great-Aunt Evelyn's reset engagement ring, the diamond pried from its cursed setting and placed in plain white gold. Every concession felt like stepping closer to a cliff while promising herself the fall would be gentle. In the quiet weeks after the invitations went out, Cora caught herself humming in the shower, buying white peonies at the market, imagining a future that included someone else's toothbrush beside hers. For the first time since childhood she slept without checking the locks 3 times. She told herself the curse had finally grown old and toothless. She told herself that right up until the morning she found Henry standing in the kitchen of their apartment, staring at his reflection in the black window glass as though it belonged to a stranger. The week before the wedding, Blackthorn Manor reopened its gates for the first time in 25 years, scaffolding still clinging to the east wing like ivy made of steel. Cora arrived on Monday with Henry and a moving van full of rented farm tables, determined to treat the house like any other venue. She walked the corridors in work boots and paint-stained jeans, barking orders at florists, refusing to flinch when the chandelier in the ballroom swayed though the air was perfectly still. Henry watched her with quiet wonder, trailing one hand along wallpaper that had once been rose and gold and was now the color of nicotine. He asked questions no one else dared: why certain doors were nailed shut, why the mirrors in the upstairs hall were turned to the wall, why every clock in the house had stopped at either noon or midnight. Cora answered with half-truths and jokes until the jokes ran out. Tuesday night she woke to find him gone from the guest room bed. She found him barefoot in the portrait gallery, standing beneath Eliza's wedding painting in nothing but moonlight. The canvas had been slashed decades ago and badly repaired. Eliza's painted eyes looked wet, as though she had been crying fresh blood. Henry's head was tilted at the exact angle the painted groom's had once been, and when Cora whispered his name his reflection in the dark glass stayed facing the painting long after he turned around. Wednesday the florist quit after finding every white peony in the cooler turned black at the heart overnight. Thursday, the caterer called to say his walk-in freezer had died and every cut of beef intended for the rehearsal dinner was crawling with maggots that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Cora paid triple to replace everything and told no one. Friday morning she caught Henry in the library holding a shard of mirror he must have pried from one of the turned frames. He was angling it toward the skylight, watching the dust motes dance, and when the light hit the glass his pupils shrank to pinpricks and stayed that way even after she closed the curtains. That afternoon she discovered the family portraits in the west parlor had rearranged themselves while the housekeepers were at lunch. Eliza now hung where Margaret had been, Margaret where Rose had been, Rose where Lillian should have been, and the empty nail waiting for the next bride had a fresh shadow already darkening the wallpaper beneath it. By Saturday night, the rehearsal dinner done and the guests gone home drunk on local cider, Cora stood alone on the widow's walk and watched Henry walk the garden paths below. He moved like a man searching for something he had lost centuries ago, pausing beneath the same dogwood that had sheltered Eliza and her painter, pressing his palm to the bark as though listening for a heartbeat inside the tree. When he finally looked up, the moon caught his face and for one heartbeat the smile he gave her belonged to someone else entirely. October the 24th, 2025, the night before the wedding, the rehearsal dinner unfolded beneath strings of Edison bulbs hung like low stars across the terraced garden. Laughter rose and fell with the cider. Cousins Cora hadn't seen since childhood toasted her escape from spinsterhood, and Henry moved among them with the easy grace that had first made her trust him. He kissed grandmothers on both cheeks, let uncles slap his back, and never once let go of Cora's hand except to refill her glass. When the dessert course arrived, individual chestnut cakes shaped like acorns, Cora excused herself to fetch the antique cake knife from the library safe. The blade had been Great-Aunt Evelyn's idea of a wedding gift, the same silver knife engraved EW 1898 that had vanished the morning Eliza died. It had turned up again in 1999, wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of Evelyn's hope chest, waiting for someone brave enough to use it for cutting cake instead of throats. Cora found the library door ajar, fire low, moonlight slicing across the Persian rug in silver bars. Henry was already inside, kneeling in front of the bottom drawer she had never seen him open. In his hand hung a heart-shaped locket on a blackened chain, the kind of relic that should have been catalogued and locked away years ago. He had the back pried open with a letter opener, studying the miniature photograph inside as though memorizing it. She knew the face before she even crossed the threshold. Edmund Whitlock stared out from the oval tin, raven hair slicked back, high cheekbones sharp enough to cut, mouth curved in the same half-smile Henry wore when he thought no one was watching. The resemblance was not subtle now that the mask had begun to slip, it was exact, down to the small scar bisecting the left eyebrow Henry had always claimed came from a childhood bicycle accident. He sensed her and turned. For a moment the firelight painted his eyes completely black, no whites, no mercy. Then he blinked and they were Henry's eyes again, warm river clay, confused. "I found this behind a loose panel," he said, voice soft, almost apologetic. "She looks like you." Cora's pulse hammered so hard she tasted copper. She took the locket from his unresisting fingers. On the inside of the lid, scratched with something sharp, were words in a handwriting she recognized from Evelyn's confession, "He will wear the face you love best." Henry reached to touch her cheek and the overhead bulb popped, showering sparks that died before they touched the rug. In the sudden darkness his silhouette seemed taller, shoulders broader, the way a shadow grows when the light is wrong. "Tomorrow," he whispered, and the word tasted like the last breath before a scream, "you'll never have to be afraid again." October 25th, 2025, ended the way it began, bright, merciless, and wrong. The ceremony had been perfect in the way only doomed things can be. Cora walked the aisle beneath a bower of white dogwood that refused to wilt even when the temperature climbed past 80. Henry waited at the altar in dove grey, eyes shining with what everyone later swore was tears of joy. When the minister said, "You may kiss the bride," Henry's mouth tasted of copper and wintergreen, and for one heartbeat his tongue felt too long against hers, as though something inside him had tried to crawl out and greet her properly. The reception spilled across the lawn until sunset bled violet across the mountains. Then the guests drifted away in a rustle of silk and good luck rice, and the manor swallowed the newlyweds whole. Cora had insisted on the bridal suite on the second floor, the same room where Eliza had died. She told herself it was to face the past head-on, But really she wanted the windows that opened onto the balcony, an escape route, if escape was still possible. The staff had laid out champagne, white roses, and the silver cake knife on a side table like a loaded gun. Henry locked the door at 11:47 p.m. and turned the key twice, slow and deliberate. He set it on the mantel beside the dying fire, out of her reach. The candles guttered. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in the space of a breath. Henry loosened his tie and began unbuttoning his waistcoat, fingers moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had done this before. When the last button slipped free he looked up, and Cora saw the moment the mask finally fell away. His eyes were pits now, black from edge to edge, reflecting nothing. The bones of his face shifted under the skin like something trying to remember its original shape. His mouth widened, too wide, revealing too many teeth, and when he spoke the voice was layered, Henry's baritone laid over something older, drier, hungry. "Eliza," it said, tasting the name like wine gone to vinegar. Margaret. Rose. Lillian. And now Cora. 5 brides for 5 failures. But this time the vow was spoken willingly, in daylight, with love in your mouth. The debt is ripe. He stepped out of Henry's shoes. They hit the rug with the hollow sound of empty shells. Cora's back met the bedpost. The cake knife was still on the table, 6 feet away, gleaming like a promise. The thing wearing Henry smiled Edmund Whitlock's smile and reached for the top button of her dress. His fingers were ice against her throat. Midnight began to gather in the corners of the room, thick as smoke. The clock in the hall began its first chime at 11:59 and 52 seconds. Cora lunged sideways, shoulder slamming the table so hard the champagne bottle toppled and shattered. The cake knife spun once in the air and landed in her palm like it had been waiting 127 years for her grip. The silver was warm, almost feverish, the engraved EW pulsing against her skin as though Edmund's own heart had been hammered flat into the blade. The thing in Henry's body hissed, a sound like steam escaping old graves, and moved faster than any living man should. One hand, no longer Henry's hand, closed around her wrist, nails lengthening into yellowed talons that scored her skin. Black blood welled where it touched her. It smelled of turned earth and funeral lilies. The second chime. She drove her knee upward, felt cartilage give somewhere that should not have cartilage. The creature staggered just enough. Cora twisted, brought the knife around in a short, savage arc. The blade met resistance, then sank to the hilt just beneath the sternum. For one impossible heartbeat nothing happened, the room held its breath with her. Then the third chime rang and the world tore open. The body wearing Henry convulsed. Black blood, thick as tar, poured from the wound and ate the rug where it landed, hissing like acid. The face slid, Henry's features melting downward like candle wax to reveal Edmund Whitlock beneath, skin parchment pale, eyes burning green coal. The mouth opened impossibly wide and something vast tried to crawl out, something with too many joints and a voice made of every scream the house had swallowed since 1898. Cora twisted the knife deeper, felt bone part, felt the silver bite something that was not bone at all. She leaned in until her forehead touched the things and whispered the only words Evelyn had made her memorize: "The debt is paid in the blood you borrowed." Midnight struck its 12th and final note. The creature shrieked once, a sound that shattered every window in the east wing and sent centuries of dust cascading from the rafters. Then it collapsed inward, folding like burning paper. Henry's body, no, the shell that had worn Henry, burst into black ash that swirled upward in a perfect column before dissolving into nothing. The knife clattered to the floor, suddenly cold, ordinary, clean. Cora stood alone in the bridal suite at 12 hours and 3 seconds, dress torn, wrist bleeding, lungs on fire. Outside, the wind died. The candles steadied. Somewhere far below, a single dogwood petal drifted through a broken pane and landed, white and perfect, on the exact spot where Eliza's blood had first soaked the floorboards all those years ago.